Jane's immobility served as a warning to Peter. He raised his head and looked at Jane's face. Her gaze was fixed on the edge of the bed, tears streaming down her cheeks. He became concerned. "What's wrong, dear?" Jane, unaware that Peter had stopped doing what usually gave her pleasure, continued to sob uncontrollably. Peter immediately returned to the bed and hugged her, waiting for her to calm down. "No, Peter, it's not that. I'm just not sure I'm doing the right thing. I've loved him for 20 years and, well, I don't think he's done anything wrong, and I don't want to risk losing my children." Peter sighed. He knew this all too well. "We've been through this before, dear. This guy is a workaholic. What time does he get home? After 7 every night? And then he works almost every Saturday. And for what? Look around you. He's been working for 20 years. He's had his own business for 5 years, and you live in this little house, barely enough money to put food on the table. A beautiful 40-year-old woman like you deserves better. You deserve what I can give you. If you want, I can talk to my lawyers again and see if we should stay in this house. If it brings back bad memories, maybe we can move in with me." "No, your lawyers were right. Agreeing to stay into the house where the children grew up will maximize my chances of getting primary custody. If I move into your mansion, Dave will stay here, and the children may decide to stay with him, out of habit. We can't rely on your plan to cripple his business and leave him penniless until the custody case is settled. I can't lose my children. Besides, he quit a high-paying job and started a business only because I pushed him to do it. I wanted him to achieve something in life. It's not his fault that the crisis hit right after he started the business, and he had to lay off several employees and do most of the work himself. He works long hours because he's doing the work of 3 people. However, he's convinced that the economy will recover soon and is investing money to make it happen before then. Like I said, he doesn't deserve what we're doing to him." Peter took a slow, deep breath. Jane was as heavy as a racehorse, and he knew he had to be patient. "Maybe, darling, but I've explained to you why we have to do this. Trust my lawyers, they're the best money can buy. The children will be back in an hour. We'll sit down with them and explain that you've fallen out of love with their father. They'll understand. I'm sure they have friends whose parents are divorced. Dave will be handed the divorce papers and a restraining order when he returns from his business trip. I've made sure that they can't use anything as grounds for the restraining order. It will only be valid for a month, but that should be enough time for the children to come to terms with their new reality. By freezing the company's bank accounts, we achieve 2 goals. First, it creates the impression that he cannot afford to get custody. And second, it deprives him of money and limits his access to quality legal assistance. All of this can be fixed, but I'm sure it will take at least a month. He won't starve to death. He can go to court to get a modest salary and working capital for his business. We'll unfreeze everything as soon as the guardianship is in your name. Then he can take the house, the business, and everything else, and you and the children can move in with me." Peter spoke softly and reassuringly. He had explained all his lawyer's proposed maneuvers to Jane many times, but it was clear that she needed to hear them and his assurances again. "The only thing that could derail these plans and force us to play harder is if he wants equal custody rights. I'm willing to let him have the children once or twice a month, but I want them to think of me as their father and my house as their home, not just a place to stay for a week. When they see what I can buy them, I'm sure they'll be thrilled." "I don't know, Pete. He lives for those kids. He'll be devastated. Maybe we should—" "No, Jane. We've been through this before. It was part of the agreement, remember? He'll be in such a desperate situation that he'll grab at any straw we throw him." Jane still looked very depressed, and Peter lowered his hands. "Listen, Jane, Dave will be upset for a month or so, and then when he realizes that everything is back to normal and he can see the children, he'll come back. In the meantime, you'll get what you deserve. My friends you've met love you, and we all will too. I'm sure my kids will accept you, and even if they don't, they're grown-ups. Your friends will believe that you and Dave broke up, and for those who don't, we can always hint that Dave was cheating on you. Everything's under control." They hugged until it was time to shower and pick up the children from school. To take their minds off things, they talked about where they had met just a year and a half ago. Peter was a patron and board member of the museum where Jane worked as a tour guide. For Peter, it was love at first sight. And since he could afford anything he wanted, he simply had to have her. When the children came home from school and settled into their seats, Peter did most of the talking. To say that the children took it badly would be an understatement. The story that they had fallen out of love didn't help, and they demanded to see their father, not quite understanding what a restraining order was. 13-year-old Chloe, the youngest, kept asking what her father had done wrong. The only way Jane could cope was to look around her modest home and imagine the widower's 16-room mansion with 2 acres of manicured gardens where she would soon be moving. They remained sitting in the living room after the children had gone to their rooms. Jane flinched when the message came that Dave's plane had landed. When the lawyers sent word that the documents had been delivered, they sat in silence, waiting to see if Dave would show up if he was going to ignore the restraining order. They began to relax, especially Jane, when the jingle of keys sounded and almost immediately a loud knock on the door made them both jump. They decided that Dave must have come in to look at the papers and realized he was in breach of the order. The banging stopped, and Jane held her breath, hoping the worst was over. After a brief silence, the room was filled with his frantic cries for the children and banging on the front door, which could be heard in the children's bedrooms. It took all their combined strength to keep Bart, Deb, and Chloe from breaking down the door. It was the hardest thing Jane had ever done, but she knew it was for the best. Peter sent a pre-prepared message to his lawyers, and a few minutes later, Bart looked out of the window and announced that the police had arrived. Turning away from the window, he looked at his mother with disgust and went to his room. The girls followed his example, both in tears. 5 minutes later, the police left with Dave. 2 hours later, during an almost silent dinner, there was another knock on the door and shouts demanding to see the children. The police were called again, and this time Dave was let out in handcuffs and taken away in a van. The children were distraught and refused to eat. All 3 rushed to their rooms, slamming the doors behind them. Jane was not much better. They only calmed down when Peter's lawyer called to say that Dave had been taken to jail for the night for contempt of court. The next day, no one wanted to leave the house, so everyone stayed in. Peter noticed that the small lawn needed mowing and called the gardener to come and do it. Right after lunch, when the children had left for Jane's sister's house accompanied by one of Peter's lawyers, there was more banging on the door and shouting. This time Jane whimpered and hid, clearly upset by the shouting of her soon-to-be ex-husband. The phone rang, and the police took the shouting man away. This time, the lawyers said that Dave would remain in prison until he could convince the judge that he would no longer violate the restraining order. 3 days later, they were ready for Dave's release, but nothing happened. Despite all the influence of his legal team, Peter and Jane had been unable to set a court date for custody for 3 months and had to wait a very long time. The children completely ignored both of them while their father was in prison, and after that, they only spoke to their mother when absolutely necessary. They almost completely ignored Peter. He seemed invisible. Dinner was mostly awkward. Jane answered all the children's questions in monosyllables, and when Peter spoke, she remained silent. Peter promised Jane that it would pass. When Bart was 17 and about to get his driver's license, Peter brought home several catalogs with photos of various expensive cars. The next day, Jane announced that she had found them in the rubbish. Deb and Chloe's suggestions to buy a pony were ignored. Peter and Jane kept quiet to wait it out. Peter waited until Dave was away for a few days and suggested that Jane accept the offer. She refused. The next day, a luxurious king-size bed was delivered, but Peter couldn't sleep on it. Jane told Peter that she was too worried about Dave to relax. Peter instructed his lawyers to prepare a report on his rival's affairs. Unfortunately, they delivered the report while he and Jane were at the office signing documents. It was 2 weeks after Dave's release, and Jane concluded that he no longer posed a threat. Perhaps she could convince Peter to lift the restraining order. It would be better for friends and family if there were no restraining order. The battle for moral superiority had begun. Soon, Peter's lawyers reported that Dave had disappeared. He had not applied to the court for living expenses or access to limited business resources. Dave had no other relatives. He was an orphan, and Jane had no idea where he had gone. Calls to mutual friends yielded no results. A call to his secretary at work resulted in the woman, whom Jane still considered a friend, practically hanging up on her. Peter showed no interest in helping with Dave's affairs, saying there was no need. Peter was even more concerned by the fact that Dave hadn't signed any legal documents, which would significantly slow down the process. Peter began to worry about Jane's health. She wasn't eating well, and the inner glow that had attracted him from the beginning had sadly disappeared. Finally, he convinced her that they needed to get away for a week. Her parents were coming the following weekend. They would spend Saturday and Sunday together, and then Jane would ask them to look after the children while she and Peter took a break. This reminded Jane. She had an unpleasant conversation with her parents ahead of her. They had always considered Dave the son they never had. She had to tread very carefully. For 2 hours, they rehearsed the official story. She and Dave had grown up and broken up. Peter was a friend who had helped her through it. and somewhere after the breakup, they had become more than friends. The phone call brought the expected disappointment. Jane's parents had agreed to stay for a week. Jane was only able to truly relax after a long conversation with all the children, convincing them that no one was interested in hearing about their day from the nanny and their dad. The decision was made. Jane visibly relaxed and began to dream of a week's holiday. Peter smiled, realizing that he had handled the situation successfully. The following Monday, he chartered a private Learjet to take them to Phuket. The next day, Wednesday, Jane decided to resume her sports activities. As it was a beautiful day, one of the last of late autumn, she decided to take a walk in the local park. Her job as a guide was insignificant compared to what Peter earned, so she quit and was now trying to become what she had always wanted to be, an attentive housewife. The park sloped gently down to one corner, with lawns and children's playgrounds in the center, and a memorial garden with trimmed hedges on the slope. Local and European flowers grew in different places at different times of the year. But what caught Jane's attention most was that the path ran almost along the border. For about 600 meters, it followed various slopes, making her heart beat faster and burn calories. When the children were younger, she used to run along it herself, but now she was trying to get back into shape. She and Dave, no. She wasn't going to ruin her day with memories of how she and her husband used to stop at a certain grove to chat on their way home from different restaurants after dark. The only downside to the last few years was that homeless people, whom the locals called wine, had settled here. They set up camp in the upper corner, probably because of the thick bushes and the cover of the high fence on both sides of the park. Sometimes they could be seen near the picnic tables, where they hoped to be the first to get to the rubbish bins if any discarded food ended up there. There had been several incidents recently, mostly fights between homeless people. The police sometimes chased them away, but they always came back. Jane never paid any attention to them. She liked to walk quickly up the hill past the bend and then rest on the way down. Today there were 3 or 4 of them, sitting around one of the benches with bottles wrapped in brown paper lying next to them. She had learned to ignore them like most people. Now she glanced to her right and hurried past them. She used to wonder how they ended up in such a life, but since then, her thoughts had been focused on jealously guarding the comfortable lifestyle she and Dave had earned, and she avoided them. To distract herself, Jane began to dream about her future, including a huge house with a maid and a gardener. Travel abroad. Nice cars and no need to rush to work. Yes, she had finally arrived where she belonged. If only the thought that she had sold herself to Dave and the annoying voice in her head, reminding her of her moral principles, didn't keep her awake at night. As she walked down the slope, she thought about what she had already started telling her friends, both her own and those she shared with Dave. It was a version of the story that she and Dave had broken up and Peter was just a friend. The fact that Dave had disappeared might help. There were no inconsistencies in the story. A few dinners in a luxurious mansion, and they would quickly forget about her past life. At worst, Peter had many friends who had already accepted her. Besides, Peter had children. Fiona was 24, married to Mike, a stockbroker. They had a young daughter. The 2 times they had met, she had been rather cold toward Jane. Jane could understand that. To Fiona, Jane looked like her mother, who had died of cancer 10 years earlier. Brent was 22 and a typical spoiled rich kid. He still lived with his parents, never stayed late at work, and generally led an irresponsible lifestyle. His attitude toward Jane could be described as take it or leave it. Jane stopped daydreaming when she reached the top corner again. She was on her guard. The group of winemakers had dispersed. 1 was still sitting there, 2 had left, and the 4th was rummaging through a rubbish bin in search of a late breakfast. Jane forced herself to keep an eye on the remaining 2 out of the corner of her eye. Experience told her that they were harmless in a group, but alone they would be more likely to approach her for handouts. Something about the man sitting there caught her attention. Jane couldn't quite put her finger on it. She turned to face him. The fact that his eyes were downcast allowed her to stare at him for a long time. Although he was dressed in the army greatcoat that was almost mandatory for the homeless, his trousers and boots were in better condition than those of his neighbor on the bench. His shoulders were hunched triumphantly, and his hands, clad in fingerless woolen mittens, rested on his knees. On the ground beneath him lay a rolled-up blanket tucked between his legs for protection. Between his legs lay a bottle wrapped in paper. He wore no hat. His hair was unkempt. He had not combed it for many days. His face was dirty and unshaven, and a large bruise stretched from his left cheek to his eye. As far as Jane could see, his eyes were sunken and unblinking, and tears glistened on both cheeks in the morning sunlight. Jane stepped back, but her gaze remained fixed on this clearly broken man. It was Dave. Jane's legs betrayed her and continued along the familiar path, and she automatically began her descent. After 75 meters, she stumbled, stopped, turned around, and stared at him. She was overcome by an overwhelming sense of guilt, and her knees almost buckled. In the blink of an eye, she realized that Peter's plan, and she had to admit her plan, had worked too well. Struck in the back by the man who was supposed to cover for him, crippled by business thanks to excellent legal work, cut off from his children, his purpose in life, and emotional support, Dave had given up. Plunging into alcoholic oblivion with no money and no place to live, he joined the part of society that was no longer part of his life. Jane staggered and sank down onto the nearest bench, stunned by what she had done to a good man whose only mistake had been to be forced into business at the wrong time. It was too painful for Jane to think about it. She continued to watch as a large, rough-looking man approached the bench where Dave was sitting. After exchanging a few words, Dave picked up his bottle and his belongings and wandered towards the upper entrance, then disappeared. Jane sat there for a while longer before she found the strength to get up and walk home in a daze. She sat silently until the children came home. They paid no attention to her, just as they had for the past few weeks. She was still sitting at the kitchen table when Peter returned. He stopped, looked around the room, and saw no signs of dinner being prepared. He usually had time to change into his house clothes before dinner. Jane's disappointment was written all over her face like a neon sign. Peter did the only thing he could think of. He hugged her and gently asked what was wrong. Jane burst into tears, and it took him more than 20 minutes to figure out what was going on. He held her, doing what he knew Jane and any other woman would expect him to do, but inside he was triumphant. As a competitive businessman, he wanted his opponents to suffer. Besides, the ideal scenario for Jane and her children was never to see his ex again. Everything had turned out even better than he had hoped. If Jane accepted that her husband was a loser, the idea that he had always been a loser would become much more plausible and easily acceptable. Peter ordered takeaway food to feed the children, then carried Jane to bed to comfort her. When she stopped sobbing, he fell asleep after a stressful day. Jane, however, was in for a sleepless night. Her inner conflict flared up with renewed vigor. Her conscience told her that she should give up her plans for a comfortable life with Peter and take Dave back. It would help her feel better in the short term and earn her child's forgiveness. But what were the chances that Dave would ever fully forgive her? Even trying to reconcile with Dave would mean breaking up with Peter, and she wanted that luxurious life so badly. She knew Dave would be hurt, but she didn't realize it would cause the devastation she saw today. Yesterday. What difference did it make? Despite the risk, despite the loss of her dream, she convinced herself not to back down from her plan until that fateful hour, around 3 in the morning. That was when Peter's subliminal messages began to take their sinister toll. How strong was David if he didn't lift a finger to fight for her? He fell at the first hurdle. He gave up completely. He did less to protect himself and his family than a sloth would have done. Thoughts that David was already mentally exhausted after 5 years of hard work, fighting for his business, before he had to endure the napalm attack by his wife, who betrayed him in the most cruel way, tried to break through to her. But they were rejected when she began to dream of a life in a mansion with beautiful clothes and luxury cars. Yes, she was doing what was best for her children and for herself. Dave was ready to accept that. If she could have convinced herself of that completely, she would have fallen asleep. But she didn't fall asleep. Instead, she jumped out of bed with a plan. She gathered copies of all the legal documents contained in the package Dave had given her and put them in her bag before making breakfast for everyone. Peter, convinced by her fake smile, retired to his study. The children, barely nodding, left for school on the bus. Jane didn't let their coldness weaken her resolve. At 9 o'clock, after drinking a strong whiskey, she gathered all the papers from her bag, gathered her courage, and headed to the park. She had to explain to Dave that he could still get money to live on and run his business, and that after the custody case was settled, he would be able to see the children as often as he wanted, and then everything would be fine. She took the application forms and was prepared to spend as much time as necessary to show him how to fill them out. The problem was, where was he? She crossed the road and walked through the sparse trees to the golf driving range. There were 2 homeless men standing in the far corner, but neither of them was Dave. From where she stood, she scanned the rest of the park but saw nothing that looked right. She glanced back at the bushes by the wall where she suspected they were all sleeping. But as she started to make her way through the thicket, 2 vagrants stood between her and the bushes. She walked around the streets adjacent to the park, peering into the alleys, but to no avail. Returning to the park, she slowly walked around it, looking into the bushes and all the corners of the garden, but to no avail. Disappointed, she crossed the road 100 meters from her house and headed towards it. There were 3 entrances to the house. One was through a 2-car garage, each side of which had its own roller shutter. The front door, which was accessed by a path through the gate near the garage, and the back door, which opened onto the lawn with clothes hanging on it. Jane had just put her hand on the front door handle when a familiar sound caught her attention. She looked back and saw the right roller shutter of the garage opening. It opened towards the side where Peter parked when he was home, and where Dave usually parked. She looked at the road, expecting to see Peter's BMW heading towards her, but the road was empty. After the roller shutter was fully open, there was a pause, and then it began to lower. Jane stared at it, mesmerized. The door remained closed for about 10 seconds, then began to rise again, and she was still staring at it. When the door closed for the second time, Jane tore her gaze away from it and looked around. When she looked more closely towards the low sun, she saw him. Dave was standing among the trees, looking at his old house, where he had lived for 20 years. In one hand, he was clutching the garage remote. Jane would remember this as one of the hardest moments of her life when she approached her partner of 20 years. Dave looked even worse than he had the day before. He had a fresh bruise on his other cheek, and tears were welling up in both of his sunken, tense eyes. The realization that she was the cause of such destruction was overwhelming. Jane stood next to him and tried to speak for a few seconds, but the thought that this piece of human trash had been a proud man just a month ago knocked the wind out of her. Finally, Jane gathered her strength and began to deliver the speech she had been preparing since 4 in the morning. Dave, you don't have to live like this. You can get money for food and shelter, even to run a business. You just need to fill out these forms, Jane said, handing him an envelope, and file them with the court. Here, look, I've already filled some of them out for you. Jane rummaged through the envelope, pulled out a small stack of papers, and turned to Dave. He didn't look at them. I know it must be hard not seeing your children every day like you used to. I tried to talk Peter out of it, to not let you see them until the custody case was settled, but his lawyers insisted. You can have the house back when we move in with Peter. To be honest, I didn't think it would take 3 months. Jane realized she was babbling, but she couldn't stop. Dave remained completely unmoved. His face was expressionless, and the only movement was the raising and lowering of his hand as he opened the garage door. Jane faltered and fell silent, her hand continuing to wave the court documents as if on autopilot. Her conscience gnawed at her tired brain like an eagle trying to tear apart a turtle. Her mind, which had not slept for more than 30 hours and had been haunted by nightmares for weeks, sprang into action, trying to free her from at least some of the guilt. Damn it, Dave, why didn't you fight for me? The restraining order prohibited you from coming near the house or the children, and I didn't come near you. You could have met me away from the house and at least tried to talk me out of it. You could have cornered Peter and at least threatened him for sleeping with your wife for the last 6 months. You could have gone to court and tried to get that fake restraining order lifted, so why did you just give up and do nothing? Why, Dave? Jane had moved closer during her tirade and now stood with a red face directly in front of Dave, her posture and tone defiant. He didn't move, just dropped the garage remote on the floor. He continued to stare past her at his former home. From such a close distance, Jane could see how dirty he was, and his nose confirmed that he hadn't washed in a long time. She couldn't hold back the tears streaming down her cheeks because, strangely enough, she was the reason for his distress. She was about to turn and run away from the source of the horror standing in front of her when he spoke. His gaze remained unfocused, and his voice was flat and monotonous, barely audible as a whisper. Some of the words had no usual inflections, so their meaning was difficult to understand, and she had to concentrate. So that's how it is, huh? No excuses, 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 no excuses. Dave fell silent, and that hurt Jane much more than his words. She spoke to fill the screaming silence. I'm sorry, Dave. I had to sleep with him, otherwise he wouldn't have stayed. But I never brought him to our house. But you've already been there. Just take your documents, please. Find something to eat, find a place to stay. Try to find a job. Things will work out soon. You'll get your house back. Despite what Peter wants, I'll let you see the children more than once a month, you'll see. Stop being so apathetic, so... The word lazy came to Jane's mind. Laziness. She bit her tongue. Just take care of yourself, please. Jane stopped and just stood there, gasping for breath. After a few seconds of silence, she simply couldn't look at that dirty, emaciated face any longer. She turned away, Finally, Dave spoke again in his quiet, lifeless voice. She had to strain to hear him. Tell me, wife, do you have to go to court for money to eat? Do you have to fight for the right to rummage through rubbish bins if someone throws away half a hamburger? Can you only eat a hot meal twice a week because that's all the local soup kitchen for the poor and homeless has to offer? Do you have to find a secluded bush every night to spread out your blanket and fall asleep, hoping and praying that it won't rain? Do you have someone to share your blanket with? Can you see your children whenever you want? Or do you have to stand here every morning hiding, just to catch a glimpse of them? And by the way, the lawyers of that bastard who stole your wife can't stop you from seeing your children. They can only offer it to you. After all, you decided to do this to me. Jane knew this, and the knowledge tore her apart. How she wished Dave had just yelled at her when it all happened, completely ignoring the fact that she had put a restraining order on him and hidden behind closed doors. She could no longer fight the urge to turn around and run away. She awkwardly shoved the court papers into the large pocket on the side of Dave's coat and rushed for the door. Stay here, Dave. I'll bring you food and money. As she crossed the street to buy food, she made up her mind to meet Peter and insist that he let Dave see the children. Right now, she gathered everything she could find in the refrigerator and put it in a reusable shopping bag. But as soon as she reached the gate, she saw that Dave was gone. The only trace of him was the court papers fluttering in the wind like confetti. Jane turned and slowly walked back down the path. It took her all day to shake off the guilt caused by Dave's simple questions, but she managed it. By the time the children came home, she had already started berating him again for his mental laziness, for giving up at the first hurdle. After chatting with their mother, the children got dressed and, following their new habit, went out for a walk until dinner. Yawning with fatigue, Jane prepared dinner. She didn't say a word to Peter about her day. He wouldn't have liked that she had started seeing her ex without telling him. Jane went to bed much earlier than Peter and slept soundly. When he came home, he felt tired, but the thought of what Jane had whispered she had made for him cheered him up. Chapter 2. For Jane, it was another sleepless night as her conscience tormented her again for her actions. Once again, her options were pulling her in different directions. Should she call the police and tell them that the garage door had been left open, which was clear evidence that Dave was stalking her? At least in prison, he would get 3 meals a day. No, she couldn't do that. By dawn, another compromise plan had been worked out. Although Dave hadn't mentioned it yesterday, she knew that what worried him most was not seeing his children. If she could change that, he might be able to pull himself together enough that when everything settled down, he could come back for good. To see the children, the restraining order had to be lifted, but how could she convince Peter to allow that without revealing his secret mission on Thursday? On Saturday morning, she woke Peter at 7 and began trying to convince him to let Dave see the children. There was no response. Peter quickly cut her off, mocking her weakness, apathy, and lack of courage. He refused to budge from his plan. Giving up, Jane quietly left to reprogram the garage door opener. She couldn't wait for Monday when she and Peter would leave on holiday and she could finally relax. Jane left at 10 in the morning to pick up her parents from the airport. Peter stayed behind to clear his things out of the house. He planned to spend the next few nights at his place. After meeting up and making the usual small talk about the flight, she went to a familiar cafe to talk about her marriage. She didn't want to have to drive while her emotions were running high. This is where Dave's disappearance came in handy. The official story was well rehearsed. Jane had told it to various friends over the past few weeks. When Dave found out that Jane wanted to break up, he gave up on everything and disappeared, leaving her and the children behind. She wanted the breakup to be amicable, out of respect for all the years they had spent together, but it didn't work out that way. She asked them not to mention it to the children, as it was a very painful subject for them. Fortunately, the children did not know all the details of the ambush on their father or what Jane's relationship with Peter had been like before the breakup. There was no need to change anything when telling the parents about Peter. The friendship that had been strengthened during the turbulent times of the breakup was very strong. The parents were still disappointed, but they accepted that people drift apart. However, they noticed that Dave was not prone to breaking his commitments and did not believe Jane when she said that he had become a victim of his own laziness. The children were happy to see their grandparents and behaved like good conversationalists when Jane's parents met Peter in the evening. They were wary of him, but they loved Dave sincerely. Jane and her mother talked for another hour after the children went to bed. Her mother was surprised that her daughter didn't seem more upset about the breakup. Stunned by her mother's words, Jane left as soon as it was proper. Lying to her mother was extremely awkward. Besides, her mother knew her too well. Jane was afraid that her mother would figure her out if she had to spend even another minute with her. Despite her exhaustion, she couldn't fall asleep again. The next morning at breakfast, Jane's father mentioned that around 4 o'clock in the morning, he had been awakened by the sound of the garage door opening and closing, which seemed to be moving on its own. Jane told him that this had been happening for several days and that a repairman would come on Tuesday to fix it. She was quietly terrified. If Dave was watching the house, he might find out that her parents had come to visit. If he came within the next week, her plan could be ruined. She was torn. She desperately needed a break, but at the same time, she was afraid to leave her parents and children unattended. Another circumstance weighed on her overburdened mind as she walked towards the life she deserved. On Monday, shortly before lunchtime, Peter arrived in a chauffeur-driven limousine. They had agreed to show her parents the benefits of his wealth. The plane they were flying to Thailand on did not belong to Peter, but he had chartered a Learjet for the trip. Apart from the two pilots, they were the only passengers. Jane fell asleep before the plane even gained altitude. There was no question of joining the high-altitude club. Peter woke her up just in time to fill out her immigration card, which she completed just as the plane's wheels touched down on the runway in Phuket. After a limousine ride to the luxurious bungalow in a private resort that Peter had borrowed from a friend, there was only time for a long shower before dinner. Peter asked Jane about her strange behavior and sleepiness. Jane felt guilty for hiding the truth from him. Guilt. It seemed to be a constant presence in her life lately. She drank too much at dinner, and Peter helped her back to the chalet with disgust. He laid her on the bed, intending to undress her after the electric blinds were completely lowered. Jane was almost asleep when she heard the first sound of the roller shutter motor, which in her drunk, tired, and guilty mind sounded exactly like a door sliding open. She jumped up with a scream, adrenaline replacing the alcohol in her body. Peter looked at her in confusion. She refused to tell him what was going on again. He spent another night in chastity, and his anger grew. And again, Jane lay awake all night listening to him snore. The next day, Peter organized a deep-sea fishing trip. He enjoyed fishing, while Jane dozed in the shade at the bow of the boat. When she first met Peter at the museum, she realized she needed a competitive edge. Books and conversations with friends became research material, and a selection of Lebanese pickles became props. Within a month, she was able to hold her own against the Thai girl. When Peter was fully recovered and Jane took him under her wing, she smiled, and not for the first time. Jane wondered if his below-average physique was the reason for his desire to dominate as a businessman. When Peter fell asleep again, Jane got up to brush her teeth. After breakfast, she explained her plans for the next day to Peter and asked if he agreed. He barely glanced at the packaging and price before agreeing. Jane was delighted. The package for the whole day cost more than her former family earned in a month. She deserved it. After booking their tickets, they headed to the beach and found a secluded spot. She wanted to be alone in the nearby coconut grove, but Peter insisted on returning to the bungalow. Thoughts of paparazzi and private investigators made him nervous, and he couldn't do this in public. Jane knew that Dave wasn't capable of organizing detective work, even if he managed to scrape together the money for it. But that was quickly forgotten when a familiar voice came over the phone speaker. "Just friends, right? Jane, it's Mum. I saw David in the park this morning. When you've sorted yourself out, give me a call. We need to talk." Then there was silence, as if the connection had been cut. Jane was in shock. It was a double blow, not only because her mother had overheard her conversation with Peter, but also because her mother knew about Dave. She said she had met Dave that morning. Met, not seen. God, which of her lies had been exposed? Chapter 3. Peter left her alone, popping into the bathroom for a moment and assuring her that everything would be fine. Jane was far from sure about that. Resisting the urge to bury her head in the sand and pretend the phone hadn't rung, Jane picked up the phone, asked Peter to leave her alone, and went into one of the bedrooms in the chalet. She didn't spend much time preparing for the conversation. All she needed to tell her mother was that her physical relationship with Peter had only begun on this trip. The rest depended on what Dave and her mother would say. With trembling hands, she dialed her mother's number, entering the international code correctly on the third attempt. "Yes," came the reply. "Mom, first of all, I'm sorry you witnessed that, but from what you heard, Peter and I have moved on to a more physical relationship." There was a long, deafening silence on the other end of the line. Finally, "Did you really think the children wouldn't tell us about your lover who slept in the same bed with you after you stabbed David? I can't express how disappointed your father and I are in you, Jane. Not just because of what you did to your husband, but because you lied to us. To think that our daughter could do such a thing, I just can't accept it." I feel like I don't know you anymore. Your father feels the same way. He's so upset that one of his little girls could do such a thing. I think you should come home immediately. Your father said we were brought here under false pretenses. Let us know when you're on your way and call us when you're half an hour away. We'll ask the neighbor to look after the children for half an hour if you're running late. In any case, I don't want to see your lying face, and neither your father nor I want to see that bastard you're seeing anymore. You are seeing him. Never. Jane was stunned. Her mother didn't like to swear or use harsh words. But Mum, I need a break. That's out of the question. Before the line went dead, Jane heard her father's voice in the background. Tell that slut. That slut. Her father had called her a slut. Jane's hands were shaking so badly that it took her several attempts to dial the number, but she did it. Then she put the phone on the bed, knowing that the speakerphone was still on. This shit had to end. Now. Mum, I'll come home as soon as I can. Peter will book my flight. I'm sorry I lied to you. Just forgive me, okay? I thought if you found out that Peter and I were sleeping together, you'd think I was rushing things. That you'd stop respecting me, that's all. When Dave left, before you're tempted to lie to me again, Jane, let me tell you that Dave and I had a long talk today after I ran into him at the park. We sat on a bench. He refused to come over for coffee because of some court order or something. Do you know anything about that, Jane? It doesn't sound like the friendly breakup you described. My God, woman, this man is broken. Maybe you'll give up your recent habit and tell me what really happened? Come to think of it, I don't want to sit here all day. Did David do something to deserve being kicked out? Not to mention everything else you did? Not really. I think I just fell out of love with him. He was always at work or so tired that he just didn't have time for me. Well, we both know why he worked so much, don't we, Jane? And then, I suppose, along came this Peter in his fancy car and offered to fly you to Thailand in a private jet, no less. He must have been great and swept you off your feet. Please tell me it's not because you want a better lifestyle. But Mum, I will never have to worry about money again. Peter has a huge house on the other side of town. I won't have to work, and he's already said he'll pay for the children to go to the best schools. I did it for them. Nonsense, Jane. In my day, that was called gold digging. Tell me, why did you have to set David up like that, reporting him when he came back from his business trip? Peter's lawyers said it would be best. I'll refrain from commenting, Jane. Why did you get a restraining order? Peter said that if I stayed in the house, it would improve my chances of getting custody of the children. He refused to share the house with David, so the only option was to get a restraining order. And on what grounds did you get it? I know for a fact they don't hand those out like candy. Well, I may have hinted that Dave was abusive towards the children. In the background, Jane heard her father snort derisively and realized that her mother had put the phone on speaker. Her mother's voice rose a couple of octaves in disapproval. That's disgusting, Jane. They were the meaning of his life. I know I didn't want to do this, but it was Peter's idea. He assured me it wouldn't stay on Dave's record forever. After the custody hearing, I'll let Dave see the children whenever he wants, but right now I can't risk even the slightest chance of losing them. I want sole custody, not joint custody. I can't believe this. So tell me, if this jerk Peter is so rich, why did he leave your husband without even paying for dinner? The poor guy was humiliated when he tried to check into a motel, but they told him none of his credit cards worked. Jane listened to her own excuses and realized more and more how petty and fickle she was making herself look. So she moved on to her main reason, limiting Dave's access to quality legal help. Peter said it would improve my chances of getting sole custody, she said. Stop hiding behind that jerk, Jane. He couldn't make you do anything. You filed for a restraining order, you clipped your husband's wings, you broke his heart and begged him. You! This near cry of unspoken disapproval stunned Jane. Her mother rarely behaved like this, raised her voice. It was rare, but she never shouted. Jane couldn't speak while her mother caught her breath. She grasped at straws to soften the condemnation coming through the phone. But Mum, when I saw him in the park, I told him how to find money to live on. I even offered to bring him some food. He refused. What else could I have done? He won't help himself. Yes, I understand what you mean, Jane. I offered him money too, but he refused. I didn't understand why until your father explained it to me. I should have understood. After all, I've known Dave for 20 years. He's a proud man, Jane. He supported you first, and then his whole family his entire adult life. Of course, perhaps not at the level you felt you deserved, but you've never gone hungry or suffered serious hardship, have you? He's the kind of man who supports others. The idea of accepting charity goes against his very nature. To accept anything from you would be charity. He may not have a family to support, but he'll be damned if he'll support anyone else. If he doesn't have money, the only way he can feed himself is to live on the streets and scavenge for food in rubbish bins, which is what he's doing. At that moment, Jane's mother burst into tears, and it was without a doubt the most horrible sound Jane had ever heard. She didn't know if it was sympathy for Dave's suffering or disappointment in herself. Until the day she saw Dave in the park, she had been so focused on improving her own life that she had hardly given any thought to other people's feelings. The idea that she would have to compromise her principles a little and act unconditionally in order to achieve a carefree and luxurious life was too tempting. Now, all her inner defenses were overwhelmed by the thought that she had completely lost the respect of her mother and father and ruined the life of a good man, a devoted man who had dedicated every minute of his life to one altruistic goal: her and their children. She had repaid his devotion and loyalty to the family with a knife in the back. Her conscience was on the verge of collapse. She needed time to think. Loudly, to drown out her mother's loud sobs, she said, "I'll come home as soon as I can, Mum. Peter can explain everything better than I can." The 10 seconds of silence that followed seemed like an eternity to Jane. Finally, she said, "Jane, there's a name for people who sell their bodies and souls for material gain. It's called a prostitute. And if I want to hear shit from someone, I'll fart." The silence again made Jane realize that her mother had hung up. She hung up too and buried her head in the pillows of the spare bed. Peter watched her from the doorway with anger and concern. When he fell in love with this woman, he buried a fundamental trust issue with her because she was a liar. And he fell in love with her, almost as much as he had loved his late wife. The fact that she had been in contact with her husband and hadn't told him anything shook him to the core. He saw her reaction to her mother's words and could guess at the torment and confusion going on inside her. He knew she must be questioning her actions, and that frightened him. He had already lost love once and didn't want to go through it again. Hiding his resentment, he decided to show her love and forgive her, promising himself to be more vigilant in the future. Part of the conversation he overheard reached his consciousness. The fact that he would probably never find common ground with his new relatives was unpleasant for both him and Jane, but it didn't stop them. No, what hurt him most was that his desire to win the heart of this beautiful woman had cost another man his life. Like most people, Peter considered himself a decent man. The sudden thought that he could have forced a man to give up everything and live on the streets troubled even his undeveloped conscience. His previous sense of triumph now seemed despicable to him. He pushed aside the unfamiliar pain and did what he did best: planning. Planning how to move forward. Quietly stepping away from the door, he sent a message to his assistant to book a Learjet as soon as possible. Peter stared at the screen of his phone, at Jane's smiling face. He watched until the screen went dark, wondering whether to contact the private investigator his company worked with and get information about Jane so they could follow her when they got home. He turned on his phone, looked at Jane's face again, and decided against it. He returned to the guest room and hugged Jane, who was devastated. He scolded her for hiding information from him. And during the 5 hours it took them to pack, Peter thought he had convinced Jane that her relationship with Dave had no future and that her only future was with him. All the way home, he talked about what he could give her, continuing the seduction he had begun months ago. Yet, in his heart, doubts and mistrust of her remained. Chapter 4. Dreams of a luxurious future helped Jane forget about Dave's pain and the fact that she was the only reason for it. Peter managed to convince her that as soon as the custody battle was over and all restrictions were lifted, Dave would return to society and eventually overcome his pain. She half-jokingly, half-seriously tried to convince Peter to ease some of the restrictions, particularly the restraining order, but he was adamant. He wanted everything to be his way. As agreed, Jane wrote to her mother as they left the airport. The children were at school, so the house was empty when they arrived. Peter asked Jane to write to her parents to find out what flight they were on and have them upgraded to business class, but all he got in response was a curt no. Jane realized that the only upside to returning early was that they would be able to go to the neighbor's party on Friday night. It was a tradition that all her closest friends followed once a month. The venue rotated among a dozen families. This month, the party was at Sarah and John's house. Sarah was Jane's best friend, and she had been told the same story as her parents. Jane tried to call her on Wednesday and Thursday, but there was no answer. Finally, on Thursday evening, the day before the party, Jane left a message saying that she and her new boyfriend would be coming. On Friday morning, Jane went to check if there was a reply. but couldn't find her phone. Peter took it out of a crack in the sofa when he got home that evening, then hurried to get ready for the party and win over Jane's friends. If she had looked at Peter's face during the conversation, she might have guessed that he was hiding something. That day, he had taken Jane's phone so that an IT specialist could install spyware on it. If Jane had checked the messages on her phone, she could have avoided the humiliation that was about to unfold. They rushed to Sarah's, arriving about half an hour later than their usual meeting time. It was only 2 blocks away, but they took Peter's Bentley. He opened the door for Jane, who was glowing in her new designer dress. It wasn't extravagant, but it still cost as much as the average family's annual clothing budget. Jane had spent most of the day choosing this and several other dresses, paying with Peter's credit card. Holding hands, they walked past 2 men smoking at the front door. Neither of them was close to Jane and Dave, so Jane just nodded to them before entering the house. Since it was a cool evening, all the action took place in the living room and kitchen, rather than in the outdoor seating area. Jane led Peter inside, but he was met by a rapidly growing silence. The laughter, giggling, chatter, and smiles stopped after about 5 seconds. All eyes turned to the new arrivals. John glanced at the kitchen just as his wife Sarah emerged. Her slight smile quickly turned to annoyance. She hurried over to him and hissed, "Didn't you get my message?" "No, I lost my phone today. What's wrong?" John stood next to his wife to support her while she spoke. "2 days ago, John and I saw Dave in the park across from your house. He told us a completely different story, not the one you told me. Then I went to your parents. If you had read my message, you would have known that I and everyone here want nothing to do with a lying, cheating bitch who so cruelly puts her needs above those of her husband and family, treating him worse than a rabid dog. And all for the sake of changing partners. We don't want you here, Jane. Please leave." Jane was stunned. These were her friends. Confused and angry, she looked back at Sarah and scanned the room. Without exception, every gaze was full of condemnation. She suddenly felt very, very alone. Humiliated, she turned and slipped out the door with Peter following her. Halfway to the gate, she stopped. Peter almost bumped into her. Her whole body was shaking with rage. She turned and ordered Peter to stay where he was, then stormed back into the house past the smokers. Taking 2 steps across the living room, she waited for everyone to gather and growled, "Go to hell, all of you. From now on, I'll wave at you from my Ferrari when I drive past you on the street. From now on, I'm going to live in luxury. And if Dave has to suffer so I can, so be it." Turning, she staggered towards the exit, squeezed past 2 smokers huddled in the doorway, and walked past the silent Peter to her car. When she reached the car, she looked back and saw that Peter was still standing facing the house. Peter tried to make sense of what he had heard. As instructed, he had stayed on the driveway near the house while Jane told her story, so he hadn't heard her words. However, before she rushed back out, the smoker at the door asked the man leaning against it, "What did she say?" "I think she just committed social suicide." At that moment, they scattered as an enraged woman rushed past them. Peter remained deep in thought. Chapter 5. Peter knew how important friends were to women. They were definitely the more sociable half of humanity. The next morning, he organized a barbecue for all his friends at his house. He had to dig deep into his pockets to order catering at the last minute, but it was done. Jane perked up a little when she heard the news. She'd already met some of Peter's friends, but her enthusiasm was short-lived. Her attempts to engage the children were unsuccessful, as they all already had plans for the day. They arrived at the mansion, and while Peter checked that everything was in order, Jane eagerly explored the huge house again. She sat down on a huge leather sofa in the luxurious living room with a TV almost the size of a cinema screen and sighed contentedly. Rummaging through her handbag, she took out the 2 cards Peter had given her that morning. A platinum credit card and a debit card linked to his main account. Dreams of what they meant almost made her forget the traces of bodies behind her. Almost. Peter's friends began to arrive with their wives. Jane was a little shy, partly because most of the wives spoke with a much more stylish accent than she did, and partly because, although the dress she was wearing cost more than she had ever bought, it paled in comparison to most of the others. Peter introduced her as the love of his life, and the other women seemed happy to accept her into their circle. Almost all of them asked for her phone number and promised to invite her to one event or another, ignoring their husbands' attempts to peek down her neckline. She politely declined when the questions became personal. The catering was top-notch. The food was first class. Champagne and wine flowed freely, as is usually the case at parties. Once everyone had gathered, they divided into groups based on gender. Jane was a little bored by the meaningless small talk among the women. How she longed for the deep and meaningful conversations she once had with Sarah. They would share a bottle of wine and discuss everything under the sun. The smile faded from her face. Sarah would be hard to replace. Jane discreetly eavesdropped on the men's conversation, but it was no more interesting. Perhaps even less interesting, since it was exclusively about business. By 3 o'clock, she had chosen 3 or 4 women with whom she could strike up a friendship. Peter, still feeling out of sorts because of his nagging doubts and pangs of conscience, was drinking more than usual. He had reached that magical moment when his confused mind decided that he would have more fun if he drank some more. He chatted loudly with his friends, too far away for Jane to hear him. She noticed that several men around him had turned in her direction. Some of the wives noticed this too and headed towards him, wanting to know what he was talking about. Jane, out of politeness, also approached him. She arrived just in time to hear, "I'm telling you, that loser didn't deserve someone like Jane. As soon as she dumped him, you know what that damn loser did? He became a vagrant. I'm not kidding. A vagrant. He just gave up. Looks like the old saying is true. Laziness is the key to poverty." Peter laughed. "Jane's a good girl, but she didn't rush back to him out of pity. She stayed with me. She knows which side her bread is buttered on. Although this week has been pretty funny. While he was rummaging through rubbish bins in the park looking for food, I was strolling around a 5-star resort in Thailand with his wife." Peter's laughter was met with silence. It seemed to grow and finally penetrate Peter's buzzing brain. He looked around and noticed Jane standing like a statue with a look of utter devastation on her face. He sobered up instantly as the last words rang in his head. Jane shifted her gaze from him to the audience. She saw more and more disapproving looks, especially from the women. Although some of them had made compromises to ensure a comfortable existence, none of them had gone to such lengths. Those who weren't looking at Jane were giving Peter equally sour looks. Jane turned and rushed away. Peter rushed after her and dragged her into the dressing room next to the front door. Jane reproached him at every turn. "You've won. Why humiliate this guy even more?" She was beginning to realize what a heartless jerk her new partner could be, how bleak her immediate future might be. And for the first time, she thought that perhaps she had made a huge mistake. Her new friends never called her. Peter was forced to stay and deal with the aftermath, but he couldn't convince Jane to stay. Assuring her that he wouldn't ruin their relationship, he gave her the keys to his luxury BMW SUV and promised to meet her on Sunday. They agreed that she would bring her children to the mansion to try to seduce them with her wealth. He arranged for his children to come too. Fiona, her husband Mike, and their 8-month-old daughter, as well as Brent. Mike was another well-known businessman, and Fiona had decided to give up her career to stay at home with the children. It was easy to persuade Brent to go with them. They just had to ask him not to go to bed until noon. Chapter 6. Peter was a little disappointed when Jane and the children arrived not in a BMW, but in her old station wagon. Jane looked unhappy, and the children were very reluctant to get out of the car. Peter greeted them and showed the children where the pool was. They ran off. Peter looked suspiciously at Jane, who was sobbing into his shoulder. When she calmed down, Peter asked where Beamer was. "Oh, Peter, it was awful. I suggested that Bart come here in the car with temporary plates and told him you'd buy him one, just like it for his 18th birthday, like you promised. He said, he may have bought you, Mum, but he'll never buy me." Then he and the others got into the station wagon. "I'm afraid I've lost them forever. Can't you lift the ban and let Dave see the children?" "I'll think about it," Peter said, knowing he was dismissing the idea. He had no intention of softening his stance. He just needed to figure out what to do. The day hadn't started out so badly. Jane's children had relaxed a little by the pool with the baby. Brent had shown up but hadn't said hello. Fiona had stayed for dinner, but Mike had left early, saying he had a meeting. Fiona had followed her husband, and her expression was so strange that it caught Peter's attention. He went over to her and asked what was on her mind. She told her father that this was the 3rd Sunday in a row that her husband had claimed to have a meeting, and that along with other unusual behavior made her suspect that he was having an affair. Mike was Peter's colleague before he introduced him to Fiona. Although Mike was 10 years older than her, Peter approved of their relationship. He couldn't believe, or perhaps couldn't allow himself to believe, that Mike was doing something so despicable to his daughter and granddaughter. After a moment's silence, he asked Fiona if she and Mike were using an app to track each other's mobile phones. Cursing herself for not thinking of that, Fiona admitted that they were and handed her father her unlocked phone, begging him to prove that her intuition was wrong. When he whispered his plan to Jane, she asked to go with him, and he, delighted at the opportunity to be alone with her, agreed. Fiona happily watched Jane's children as they splashed around in the pool. Peter and Jane jumped into her station wagon, much less conspicuous than his Bentley, and sped away. They had only driven halfway across town in the direction indicated by the app when Peter's heart skipped a beat as they approached the area of cheap motels near the airport. Finally, the app announced that they had reached their destination and were near one of them. Peter asked Jane to pull into the car park behind them. Mike's car, as big as life, was parked at number 120. Jane parked in a free space on the opposite side when a small Renault, which Peter mistook for a roller skate for pregnant women, stopped next to Mike's car. Peter's stomach churned when a young woman he recognized as Mike's assistant got out of the car and headed straight for the door of room 120. She raised her hand and knocked. Peter and Jane managed to get out of the car just as the door opened. Peter was furious. Jane lingered by the car while Peter approached the embracing couple. They scattered across the parking lot to Peter's shouts. "You unfaithful little whore! How could you treat my daughter like that? She gave you all her love and her best friend in the world." Jane decided to run after him, only to prevent Peter from going to jail for assault. He was clearly very angry. Hearing the scream, Mike broke free from his embrace and stood between his companion and the enraged man approaching them. His mind immediately went into crisis mode. Getting no response from his target, Peter continued. "And you, Melissa, didn't you get married last year? What would your husband say if he found out that his whore of a wife was meeting this bastard in a seedy motel, huh? Would he be happy to know?" Peter stopped 3 steps away from Mike, who was standing defiantly, and his cowardly assistant, waiting for an answer to his questions. Mike had always believed that the best defense was a good offense. The answer came the moment Jane caught up with her partner. "You should know, Dad. Was your whore's husband happy when he found out you were having fun with her?" Mike pointed at Jane, nodding his head. "You're in no position to lecture me on morality, are you?" Jane was stunned by how accurately these questions matched her own situation. She was outraged along with Peter when she saw Mike's assistant approaching their door. Fiona would be stunned by this news, but Mike's simple words threw in her face the fact that not long ago, she herself had been the cause of her outrage. Of course, Dave had not caught her in the act, but her betrayal was as obvious as what she was seeing now. She saw again the slightest glimpse of what she had done, and it destroyed her image of herself as a decent person. Peter stood motionless, opening and closing his mouth. The realization that he had surrendered all his moral principles had robbed him of his voice. He turned to Jane, desperately trying to convince her that he was actually a good person, but she just lowered her head. She had her own demons to fight. When he turned back, Mike and his assistant had already disappeared behind the closed motel door. Peter and Jane were lost in thought as they drove to his house. Upon arrival, Jane quietly gathered the children and left. Peter prepared to break the bad news to his daughter. He was still trying to calm her down at 9 o'clock in the evening when 2 child protection officers knocked on the door with orders to take the child into foster care. Mike launched a coordinated attack clearly planned in advance to gain custody of his daughter. He accused Fiona of being an incompetent mother. Only the intervention of her father's influential legal team prevented a disaster that night. However, this distracted them long enough for Mike to finally sort out their joint finances and obtain a court order preventing Fiona from returning home. Like many people who have been subjected to such an attack, Fiona felt humiliated. She had been studying and had to learn new things, while her husband had obviously thought everything through carefully and was well prepared. Peter never realized the irony of the situation. Mike had treated Fiona almost exactly as Peter had treated Jane's husband. In fact, Mike had taken inspiration from his father-in-law's example. In any case, it was not until after 11 p.m. that Peter was able to send Jane a text message saying that until everything was sorted out, he would stay at his house with his daughter to support her. Peter's lawyers emphasized how important it was for Jane to stay in the family home, so it looked like they would have to live apart for the foreseeable future. Jane recognized the similarities between Fiona's situation and that of her husband, David, and hoped that Peter's daughter would not suffer the same nervous breakdown as her husband. There was an element of selfishness in her hope. Of course, she did not wish such suffering on anyone, but Fiona's need had distanced Jane from her only source of emotional support. Her children didn't support her. Neither did her parents or former friends. No one. No one except Peter. She tried to push away her growing dislike for Fiona so she could fall asleep. 2 hours later, she succeeded when the sound of the garage door opening and closing 3 times made her scream into her pillow. She had reprogrammed the damn thing, for God's sake. And when Peter saw her the next day and, with the best of intentions, suggested that they all move in with him for the night, Jane lashed out at him. She accused him of jeopardizing his custody rights just to stay with her precious daughter, who was old enough to take care of herself. Peter had never seen Jane so passionate, and it shook him to the core. However, he loved her, and after Jane spent over an hour coaxing him on the phone that evening, she was confident that they had sorted things out. Chapter 7. In the end, Fiona won the court case, but for Peter, it had been a long and distracting few weeks. Weeks during which Jane had to cope on her own. Peter appointed managers to take care of most aspects of his business and spent most of his free time with Fiona. Fiona, in turn, began to harbor negative feelings towards Jane. She didn't want to be reminded that her dear father was just as capable of deceit and ruthlessness as her ex-husband. So she resisted most of her father's attempts to invite Jane over or go out together. Peter began calling Jane at home every few hours to make sure she was where she was supposed to be. He still refused to hire a private investigator to follow her. When she didn't answer his calls at school, he called her mobile. She was usually in a boutique, shopping on his credit card. Sometimes he would casually ask where she was and then pay her a surprise visit. Or he would just drive by and watch her shop alone. Once he arrived just as she was leaving an expensive clothing store. There were street cafes nearby. 2 women were sitting at a table closest to the boutique entrance. When they saw Jane, they recognized her immediately. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but from their expressions and laughter, he guessed it was a sarcastic joke. Peter looked over at Jane and saw her glance at them, then lower her head and walk away. The bags of new purchases jingling at her feet because she was clutching them so tightly. Beneath layers of new clothes, she hid her despair at being left without a friend. Peter went anyway and spent the night with Jane. 10 days after her marriage fell apart, he decided that Fiona could stay on her own. Jane, on the other hand, was in desperate need of comfort. Chapter 8. 2 days later at noon on a weekday, Peter stopped by Jane's to surprise her. When she wasn't home, he called her mobile. She said she was across the street walking in the park and asked him to wait for her at her house. When she arrived, Peter didn't notice that she wasn't out of breath and wasn't dressed for a walk. The conversation was casual. Peter wondered why she was cheating on him. Jane, on the other hand, was worried about what she had seen in the park and how it had affected her conscience. She had gone to the park that morning to find Dave. She intended to find out how much he had forgiven her. She was even prepared to beg him to take her back. Anything to get rid of her chronic loneliness and insomnia. She thought it would be a win-win situation for her. Either he would take her back, or he would tell her that it was over between them for good. At least that would spare her from having to make a decision about their future and, oddly enough, ease her conscience. Fatigue has a very strange effect on logic. She saw Dave in the upper corner of the park and her flight reflex kicked in instantly. He was surrounded by 3 other drunks, one of whom, the largest, was standing right in front of Dave. Dave fell to the ground, and all 3 of them piled on top of him, spreading his legs apart. Jane now understood why her husband had bruises every time she saw him. She called the police and told them everything, urging them to act quickly. One of the drunks saw her and guessed what she was going to do. He shouted to the others, and they all headed towards Jane. She ran. They gave up when she outran them and ran to her house. Peter called out to her. She wandered around the park until the police arrived, just before Peter did. They drank coffee at her house, and Jane began to lie, explaining why she had been in the park. When Peter's phone rang, she felt almost relieved. After a few seconds of conversation, he jumped to his feet and, without saying a word to her, rushed to his car and drove away with a screech. Then the phone rang, interrupting her thoughts about Peter's strange behavior. It was the police. When they arrived at the park, there was no one there and no witnesses either. Did she recognize any of the men? Jane denied knowing them. She didn't need any more judgmental words, looks, or thoughts. She greeted the children when they came home from school, made dinner, and was about to put them to bed when Fiona called. Her voice was full of rage. "You bitch! Did you deliberately want to destroy my family?" "What? What?" "Brent's in the hospital. He's in a coma. The police say he was in bed with a woman and her husband came home unexpectedly. The guy beat him half to death." "I hope you're happy, you whore." Fiona was the latest in a long line of misfortunes in Jane's life lately. She hardly knew Brent, and she certainly had no idea about his personal life. She stared at the black screen of her phone, wondering why on earth she was being blamed for all the problems in Peter's family. After all, it was her father who had seduced Fiona. She was a victim of all this too. She could only assume that Fiona simply couldn't blame her brother or father, but needed to vent her anger and fears. Chapter 9. That night, Jane used the time she would normally have spent sleeping to devise a plan. The result was mostly delusional, but surprisingly coordinated. Peter's lack of response to her calls told her that the bridge was most likely a smoldering ruin. There was only one option left. Jane decided to get her husband back. She decided to show him that Peter was gone for good by staging an attack on him. Of course, when Dave saw what she had tried to do, he would believe that she was a victim pursuing her attacker. The next morning at 9 o'clock, she used Peter's credit card to hire a lawyer. His request was simple. Get the restraining order against Dave lifted and file a case against Peter. Thanks to Peter's explanations, she was well aware of the procedure. Her new shark lawyer suggested she use the charges of assault and blackmail to cause damage, and Jane seriously considered it. After finishing the call, Jane gathered some food. At the last minute, she went into the bedroom and opened the gun safe in the wardrobe. Like all Australians who want to have a gun for home defense, Dave had joined a gun club and bought a .22 caliber pistol and then visited the club often enough to keep his license. He showed Jane how to use it. Jane loaded the gun and put it in her coat pocket along with the box of extra ammunition. She hoped to convince Dave to come home immediately, but if he didn't want to, she wanted to give him a chance to defend himself. She hurried to the park. Making her way through the trees, she glanced toward the winner's corner. Besides her husband, there was only one other man there, but he was attacking the cowardly Dave with a large stick. Without stopping to call the police, Jane rushed toward them. Gasping for breath, she shouted at the large winemaker, "Leave my husband alone." With surprising speed, the big man turned and headed towards the enraged woman. Jane reflexively pulled the gun from her pocket, hoping that the sight of the weapon would stop him. But it didn't help. With growing fear, Jane took aim and pulled the trigger. He didn't move. Quickly thinking, she took the gun off the safety, aimed, and pulled the trigger again. With a scream, the winemaker fell, clutching his stomach. Epilogue, 5 years later. That's an incredible story, Wendy. I've never met a couple who met in prison. It sounds like fiction. Your story will be a Netflix series soon. I swear it's the truth, Pauline. So what did you do to end up in prison? Well, I came home and found my first husband in bed with my best friend. My ex-best friend, I should say. I went crazy like a tiger snake and hit him over the head with my briefcase while he was doing his thing. The rat couldn't take it and called the police. I had just calmed down when they brought Dave in and put him in the cell across from me. God, Pauline, you should have seen him. You wouldn't have recognized him. The guy was a wreck. What his ex-wife did to him. Have you ever heard of anything so cruel? I couldn't ignore his pain. It took my mind off my own problems. It took me several hours to get the whole story out of him. He was clearly afraid of losing his children, and, even worse, that they would be raised by scum like his ex-wife and her lover. I know we just met, but something told me I could trust him, so I offered to let him stay at my place when he left home. I had a huge house after that cheating bastard I married divorced me while I was in prison. Anyway, Dave and I drank a bottle of bourbon and came up with a plan to get him custody of the kids by pushing his wife off a cliff. What else could the guy do? Rich people's lawyers had everything figured out. We didn't think it would work out so well. So how did you do it? Well, I was working as a lawyer at the time, so I knew Dave didn't stand a chance, but my first profession was in theater. I studied for a year at NIDA, the National Institute of Dramatic Arts, where Kate Blanchett and Mel Gibson studied, but while they studied acting, I studied makeup and costume design. It was my theater experience that gave us the idea. Dave pretended he was living on the streets, said Wendy, laughing at Pauline's surprised expression. If I were still studying at NIDA, I could have used Dave's makeup to look like a vagrant in my graduation project. Dave got into character by spending some time with homeless people in the park. He said it was the most educational experience of his life. Wendy fell silent when Pauline's daughter approached her, crouching down. Excuse me, Mrs. Brown. Yes, Melissa. I need to use the bathroom, but someone is using the bathroom in the pool and downstairs. I'm sorry. If you go up the stairs and turn left, there's another toilet. And if you turn right, there are toilets in all the bedrooms. If they're all occupied, go up the stairs to the top floor and use the toilet in my bedroom. Wendy watched as the girl hurried off to do her chores and join her friends by the pool. Where was I? Oh yes, Dave was settling into his role. He made friends with the park residents, bringing them food and clothes. The clothes he gave them were second-hand but of good quality. He traded them for his old clothes. I still remember how some of them smelled, like rat urine. We kept them in the shed because the smell was so unpleasant. He told them what he did for a living. Many of them were homeless after being abandoned by their spouses, so they were happy to help. Dave thinks most of them just liked having a purpose in life again. The children helped him install cameras in the bedroom and several other places around the house. Did the children know that Dave was pretending? Yes, he wanted to make sure they agreed that their mother did not have custody of them. Children are not stupid. They know which parent values them more. Our children are smarter than most, and they were very hurt by what their own mother did to their father. Besides, Dave couldn't leave his children hurt and confused, so he told them about his plan as soon as he was ready. He didn't use them as weapons, he just let them be part of the decision. We hoped that the cameras would capture not only evidence of infidelity, but also something we could use to prove that Jane was a bad mother and that Peter was a threat to the children. Dave was confident that the children would not stay for a second in the company of a vicious couple. So Dave knew Jane would go to the park on the first day because of the cameras? Yes, we got him into character quickly. With practice, it took us 5 minutes. Unlike the makeup I had to apply every morning, none of us could accept the idea of him wearing a suit in case Jane went to the park. All that was left was to intensify the hatred for the cheaters, especially Jane, to increase the pressure. The couple's trip to Phuket was a godsend, as it gave Dave a legitimate reason to tell Jane's parents the whole story while remaining in character as a devastated high school student. We wanted to deal a serious blow to her support system. I wanted to ask Wendy, do you and Dave have anything to do with what happened to Peter's kids? No, that's all Peter and the example he set for his kids and son-in-law. Dave has two opinions. Either it proved God exists, or it was just the best karma we've ever seen. Your karma moved over my dogma, huh? They both laughed when Pauline quoted Dave's favorite saying. So whose idea was it to mess with the roller door? I don't know. Dave and I don't work that way. Even at that early stage, we were very close. We just bounced ideas off each other and suggested things to each other. In the end, who can say whose idea it was? We like it. Still, a door going up and down should have tipped Jane off. How did you do that? Dave's company was in electronics, and he was thinking about how to improve the security of digital signals. He said that both the reprogrammed door controller and the mechanism for replacing it could be easily hacked. That was the reason for his trip that time. He had come up with a remote control system that couldn't be hacked and was trying to sell it. The meeting he was returning from when Jane ambushed him was the last in a series. Wendy paused to take a sip of wine. Initially, he was going to sell the concept, but the company he was negotiating with, a multinational corporation, wanted to buy Dave's company outright. That way, they could include a non-compete clause in the contract. It was an extremely generous offer, and Dave was happy to come home and tell Jane that they could live in luxury with the money. This, of course, allowed all 3 children to attend good universities and me to quit my job and return to NIDA to finish my degree. It's a bit much for a NIDA graduate to be doing costumes and makeup for a local amateur theater group, but damn it, I love it. Both women smiled as they watched the children frolic in the pool. Bart's wife waved as she and her husband played with Dave and Wendy's new addition, 1-year-old Jen. Bart adored his little sister. Out of habit, Wendy looked for her second child, 3-year-old Lockie. Every day she thanked all the gods for meeting her soulmate on the worst day of both their lives. Where's Dave? He's at the local Chamber of Commerce awards ceremony. One of his store managers is getting some kind of award for outstanding achievement, and Dave wanted to support him. The guy used to be one of the park residents. Some of them turned out to be really good people after Dave restored their faith in society. The guy Jane shot is back in college and became a lawyer. Every few weeks, he stops by for a beer after his shift at the mobile canteen that Dave sponsors. Lockie makes the poor guy show him his bullet scar every time he comes in. Sometimes he brings one or more of his grandchildren with him. He doesn't blame Dave for what happened. No, not at all. The plan was that he was supposed to just back off when Jane started waving the gun around and then come forward as a witness and give a statement to the police. He admits that he was imitating his girlfriend and that it was entirely his fault that he was shot. In fact, he told me that it was at that moment that he realized he wanted to live after all. When do you think Jane will be out of prison? We expect her to be released on parole in June this year. She was sentenced to 5 years for unlawful use of a firearm and 3 years for grievous bodily harm. Strangely, none of the witnesses corroborated her version of events, and of course Dave had time to quickly change his clothes behind a bush and cover up his bruises before the police arrived. What do the children think about her being released? It's been so long that they may or may not accept it. Dave said he would support whatever relationship they have with her. What about your ex? You haven't mentioned him. Have you come up with some fantastic revenge plan? Maybe, Wendy replied, her sly smile contradicting her modest words. But that's a story for another time. Ask me in 5 years, when the statute of limitations expires. Pauline gasped and stared at her friend. What about that rich man, Peter? What happened to him? Well, we had enough evidence from the documents we found in the house to sue him for the lies he and his lawyers told and for the trouble they caused. He paid dearly for it and became a recluse after the incident. His son never recovered and his daughter turned her back on him. I think Jane's attack made him lose all faith in women. Apparently, he spent the whole night and the next day at the hospital with his son. At some point, his mobile phone ran out of battery and he didn't answer Jane's calls. Then, the woman he loved started beating him up badly. From time to time, there are reports in the news that he is selling one of his businesses, apparently for money. Ironic, isn't it? He still has a lot of money and a huge house, but he has nothing to live on. You call that irony? What about Jane? She traded a comfortable life, a wonderful husband, a beautiful family, and for what? A prison cell? I'm sure she regrets leaving Dave. Pauline followed Wendy's gaze, looking at the luxurious house on the well-kept grounds. Children were laughing and splashing in a huge swimming pool. Wendy sighed. One woman's trash is another woman's treasure, isn't it? The end. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for the next video.